All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience and flexibility. We're sorry for making the change at the last minute, but given the situation, we know that many of folks have been affected by the fires in our areas, and so we just felt like it would be better for folks to be able to stay in the safety of their own homes and not have to be on the roads and not have to deal with anything. So thank you so much for your flexibility in that. We do very much appreciate it. I wanted to sort of just go over a couple of things to get us started. Hopefully, folks have sort of seen just a minute ago, I had the PowerPoint slides up and shared. You'll see those throughout the session. But before I get into that, at the bottom of the Zoom screen, for those folks who haven't had a lot of experience with Zoom, if you click down on the bottom of the screen, you'll see some different icons. And one that I want to point out is the chat icon. So at the bottom there, there's sort of like a talk bubble and then it says chat. If you click on that, you can send a message to me personally that's private or to anybody else who's on the call. You also can send to everyone. And so there's going to be a couple times where I'm going to ask folks to submit some questions or comments. And so I want you to have, hopefully those of you who are connected with a computer can sort of write that. If you're connected by phone, don't worry about it. There's no participation grade as a part of this workshop. But again, just wanting to sort of make sure that folks are connected. I know that there's folks who are still connecting in and working with us, but I have started to record the session. So just so that folks are aware, this is being recorded. We will send out this file to everyone who RSVP'd and also to folks who weren't able to sort of make it to the workshop itself. So I'm going to go ahead and get started in terms of sharing the PowerPoint here. So in terms of this piece, we are going to be talking about the comprehensive exam, of course, for the department. And one of the things that we are going to be doing this morning is talking about some different parts that are important to know about the comps. And so specifically, we're going to start our morning session talking about your hopes and reasons for taking the workshop and talking a little bit about maybe some stressors or anxieties that you have about it. We're going to talk about our goals and objectives of the session. We're going to talk through the structure of the examination itself, so just to prepare you of what to expect. We're going to talk about scoring experiences and why people either pass or don't pass the exam or the different questions of the exam. And then also talk about, and as a part of that, we're also going to take a look at some questions themselves. So you'll get a sense of what are some typical comps question. They may not be the questions that are going to be on the exam, but sample questions, as well as sample responses. And we have some that are not so great, and then some that are exemplary. So we'll talk about those. Additionally, we'll talk about small group preparation and study groups and that sort of thing, just to sort of help us prepare for the exam. So again, like I directed at the beginning, in that chat feature, I would love for you to just, if you're able, to type in a couple of responses to the two questions that I have here. So what do you hope to learn before you leave today? So in this couple-hour workshop, what are the things that you're hoping to learn before we end our call? And then what are some of the fears or anxieties that you might have about the comprehensive exam? So I'd like to start here. And so I'm going to give folks a couple of minutes to, if they want, to respond to these questions in the chat. So again, just type out some of those things, thoughts that you have to these two prompts. And again, I'm going to take notes of any of them to make sure that I make sure what's covered in our time together. We will hit every single one of those things. And I do appreciate overall what's in the test is a great thing that you want to know. And I promise we'll get that. So go ahead and take a couple moments to just write and respond, and we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm looking at some of these pieces, right? Um, I'm hearing from folks some concerns just in general about failing the exam. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, right? Because I think folks have some misconceptions or misunderstandings about what that looks like. So we'll go through that today. Some comments about how to best prepare for the exam, some worries about blanking on questions and not necessarily getting everything in terms of the answer. Some questions about the structure or the sort of content of the exam. So again, we'll sort of go through all of those pieces, and some other details in terms of some pieces specific to some courses, right? So that's all really helpful. We'll go through all of these. I promise most of the questions that you are writing are already covered in these PowerPoints. So we'll definitely work to do that. If at any point, though, there's questions at the end, we'll come back. And if I haven't answered them, that's an opportunity for folks to unmute yourself or to write in the chat feature, and we will definitely, by the time we end, answer any question that you have. And additionally, I also just want to say that there may be other questions that come up as you go forward, and we're still available to answer those all the way up to the exam, right? So just want to sort of put that out there. Today is not the only day that you can ask questions about the comps exam. So just wanting to sort of hopefully allay some concern and some fears, okay? So let's get into some of these pieces in terms of our goals and objectives for this morning. So the goal of this session and this workshop is to help you prepare for the examination in an effective manner. And so throughout the time together, I'm going to be presenting on information about the purpose and the structure of the comps exam, to provide practical suggestions for your preparation for studying for the exam, and also to help you create some effective exam strategies. So one of the things that I do want to sort of state before we get too far into our time together is hopefully folks got my email that I sent yesterday afternoon towards the end of the workday, and it had two attachments. One was the PowerPoint slides, and the other is a packet of materials that would normally be handouts. But in particular, if you have those, the handout file, those are things that I'm going to sort of refer to as we go through that will be helpful for you to have some access to. So if you have that somewhere so that way you can see it, it doesn't have to be in hard copy, but just so that you have sort of the ability to view it, that will be helpful. If you don't, it's okay, not a worry, but there are going to be some things that you may sort of be out of context for. But again, we're recording this. You'll have access to watch it again and to still connect to the materials once you have them in a way that you can see them too. So again, you can see them at that point too. So the purpose of the exam itself is to determine students' mastery of the knowledge and skills presented in our Counselor Ed program. So that becomes really important because we want to make sure that there is a standard set that students have in terms of their knowledge base. So what we are trying to do is ask key questions that we would expect most employers in the field that you would have to be able to answer and know in a workplace setting, right? So we're not pulling questions that are arcane or knowledge that you wouldn't be using on a regular basis. It's really trying to make sure that we're asking questions that are applicable to what you're doing as a professional, either as a school counselor or as a counselor or a student affairs professional in higher ed. So this is, I think, sometimes folks' major concern. And again, as we go through this workshop, you'll get more of a feel, hopefully, of the types of questions that we're going to be asking. But again, we want you to situate and sort of say up front, most of the things that we're doing are really sort of applying theory or theoretical concepts into practice. And those are the types of questions that you're mostly going to get on the exam. It's not going to be the details of talk about when this theorist was working, right? Those aren't the types of questions that you'll see as we move forward. So again, just wanting to sort of situate this is really the purpose of the exam, to really know that you have a good content knowledge and awareness of all of the different elements and different concepts that we think are key to entering the field. So just a little bit about registering for the exam itself. You have to register for the exam via WebAdvisor. And so if you go online to WebAdvisor right now even, and you look under the spring classes, so the spring 2020 classes, the very last class is EDCG 5XC, I think it's 01, and it says Comps Exam, Counseling and Guidance. That is the exam that you will need to take and make sure that you're enrolled in if you choose to do the comps. There is a $200 fee that's for the exam. That is included as a part of your bill for your spring classes, and you must register at least 1 week prior to the exam for a guaranteed spot. So keep in mind that the 25th of January is the spring test for the exam. And that is the first week that we're back in class. So if you need to make sure that the week before you have gone ahead and registered. So if you're one of those folks who likes to wait until the last moment to get your classes registered, please make sure that you're doing so at least a couple of weeks before the semester starts. I strongly encourage folks to get registered on November 8th. For comps, if you're doing comps, when registration opens. So on November 8th, this coming Friday, spring registration opens, and so I encourage you to register as quickly as possible. You must contact Jennifer Corsetti. Typically, Jennifer also contacts you. So once you have registered for the comps, we use the roster from WebAdvisor to indicate who has registered. Jennifer uses that to then be in touch and ask you if you want to take the exam on a PC or a Mac. So you tell us which computer you're most comfortable using, and we will then appoint you to the right computer lab. So the exam itself is typed. We provide you a computer in a computer lab here on the Thousand Oaks campus, and you are given the questions that way. So that we'll get into that in a minute. If you decide to not take the exam, you have to drop the class from WebAdvisor, or else you're going to be charged for it, and you have to let Jennifer know at least 1 week prior to the exam. There's a little bit of flexibility on that, but really we need to know in advance if you're not taking it. So about 1 week is important because, again, we don't want you to get charged unnecessarily for the exam fee if you aren't taking the exam, right? So that becomes important. So again, even if you drop it on WebAdvisor, you also do need to send an email to Jennifer letting her know that you are not going to be taking the exam any longer. All right. So the exam itself, like I said, Saturday, January 25th is the spring exam. So you need to make sure that you hold that in your calendar. General information to know, you do need to arrive between 8 and 8:30. Most folks I know will come right around 8:30. That's fine. You do need to bring a photo ID. Part of that is we need to verify, and the faculty aren't the ones who are there. The faculty are not present for the exam, again, to keep things as neutral as possible. So the staff who will be checking you in won't know, and they do need to verify who you are against the registration information. So please bring some form of photo ID with you. The exam will promptly begin at 9 a.m. You can bring a pen and a pencil. You can bring a water bottle, but all other belongings are going to be placed against the wall in the exam room, and there's no food allowed in the exam room. You can bring a lunch, of course, keep it in your bag, but you can't have any food at your station. You also, if you have an Apple Watch, you also will need to remove that and put that in your bag as well, just to let folks know. The time frame of the exam, there will be the morning block from 9 until 11 a.m., and then you'll have an hour break for lunch from 11 to 12, and then the afternoon session is from 12 until 2. And then in terms of a question, if you have accommodations through DSS regarding the exam, you can contact me directly because I'm the person who is the point of contact for comps. We will work with you and the DSS office to provide your accommodations as necessary. And so it may be that you need to come during the weekday when DSS is open in order to have that. That's fine. We'll work with that. If you have extra time, we'll work together in terms of meeting your specific accommodation need. The other piece that I want to also say for the exam is that in the morning session, you'll receive, in the morning session, in addition to your pen and paper or your pen and pencil or in your water, in the files that you get, you'll get the morning questions printed out. We also give you a blank piece of paper so you can write down anything that comes to mind, right? So do a brain dump. I encourage you to do that. Write down anything that you think would be important for you to sort of note, keep in mind, things that would be helpful for you depending upon the questions. You'll then get another blank piece of white paper and also the afternoon sessions in the afternoon block for the exam. So just keep in mind that for that blank piece of paper that you've written down in the morning, that's going to be collected with all the materials from your morning exam. You won't get those back for the afternoon. So we keep everything separate for each block. So just keep that in mind. All right, so the exam parts, certainly we will have designated if you are a CSP student CSP student is going to get the CSP exam, a PPS student is going to get the PPS exam. So definitely make sure there is human error that's sometimes involved, and we hope that this is not the case, but definitely make sure at the top of your exam that you have the correct exam, right? So if you're a CSPer and you have an exam at the top that says PPS, then you need to let the proctors or Jennifer know that there's an error, right? So just keep that aware and double check for us so that way we know that you're getting the right exam. All of the questions are short answer essay questions. And really what we're looking for are responses that are a page to a page and a half in length. It doesn't need to be any longer than that. Every single question should be able to be answered in a page and a half. So for some students, they'll do it in double space, so it might be a little bit longer. If you're doing single space, then usually it's going to be somewhere around a page. That's what we're looking for. There may be single question items, so that means that there may be just one question that you have to answer in the question. There may be single item with several parts, so there may be a question that asks you to sort of incorporate multiple different pieces within your response. And there's questions that are choice or no choice. And so what we mean by that is, I'm going to go to this to sort of give you a better sense. So there are 3 questions that you have to answer in each of the blocks. So in the morning session, question number 1 is actually 1A or 1B. And those will be 2 different topics that we have covered, 2 different classes really. And you get to choose which question you feel most comfortable answering. So you don't have to answer both, you just choose one or the other. Question number 2 is always a forced question. We will ask that across the board to everyone in your program. Everyone has to answer that. And then again, there is a choice question for question 3A or question 3B. And again, that's your choice, whatever you feel most comfortable with. That same process is mirrored in the afternoon session. So again, you're only answering 3 questions. 2 of them are going to be choice questions and 1 is forced. We'll get a little bit more into things about what might be a forced question as we move forward in our discussion this morning. So the exam information is pulled from a variety of sources, but most typically our full or part-time faculty who teach the courses are the ones who help us by giving us questions that would be covered on the exam, right? So for example, if you took school law, then potentially I'm reaching out to your school law faculty members and asking them, could you help us understand, based upon what you covered, a question that students should be able to answer by the end of their, by the experience that they've had within your classroom, right? So we try to pull from what we know that has been taught, right? We don't want things to be on the exam that you've never learned. So everything is pulled from what has been covered in classes. I would also encourage you to know that many times some of the test questions also align with assignments that you've done in some of your classes. So if you think back to your organ admin class, right? For PPSers, questions certainly are probably going to come up about the ASCA model, right? So knowing parts of the ASCA model and being able to sort of discuss that will be important. For folks in CSP, there may be organ ad questions that are about supervision or strategic planning, budgeting, right? There may be some of those things where you've had to do some of those pieces in assignments. So using your assignments to go back to and use as a study tool become really critical and very helpful. In terms of how the exam is scored, there are multiple readers in cases where we need multiple readers. So all of the full-time faculty are the ones who score the exams. Dr. Yu, Professor Rowley, Dr. Coronado, all will review exams from both PPS and CSP. I only review exams from CSP, and Dr. Ju only reviews exams from PPS, right? So based upon what we teach and our expertise, we will sort of divide the exams up accordingly. If all of the exams are scored, and I'm going to fast forward here to the next and come back to this. All of the exams are scored on a range of 1 to 4. Right, so 1 is not met. So not all parts of the question have been answered. Information is wrong, and so that would be scored a 1. 2 would be met with concerns. So there might be something that's sort of slightly off, but most of the question was correct. 3 is that it's been met entirely, and 4, met with excellence. So somebody has really crafted a very nice, full, detailed, complete answer to that. A passing score is that you have a 2 or above on all areas, right? So I'm not suggesting that your bar is at a 2, but ultimately your bar is at a 2, right? If you have met with concerns on all areas of the exam, then you have passed, and you don't have to retake questions. However, out of the 6 questions that are on the exam, if you're really hoping that you have gotten at least 4 2s, right? So 4 of the questions you've gotten a 2 or higher. If you miss 1 or 2 questions and you get a 1, not met on 1 or 2 questions, then that means you still have technically passed the exam, but you do have to retake all of the questions, the 1 or 2 questions that you have gotten a 1 on. You don't get the same question, but you get the same topic. So we still want to make sure that you have mastery of knowledge in that topic area. So let's say that one of the questions that you don't get happens to be on career development theory, right? So we would have you come in a couple weeks after you're notified, or at a time that you're prepared within that semester, and you would come in and retake a question that's on career, but it's not the same question that would have been on the January exam. And again, we provide you a laptop computer of either a PC or a Mac, and have you come in and take that in a conference room so that it's private and you're quiet. And again, if you have an accommodation, we work with DSS to provide that accommodation still. So again, if you have 3 or more questions in which you scored a 1 though, that does mean that you have to retake the comps exam in full. Typically, that means that you have to wait until the next time that the exam is offered. So after January, the next time that it would be offered would be in June. However, if there is an issue where you really, that would be an imposition, you can appeal to me as the department chair and ask that a new exam be written for you within that semester, and we will then work with you to provide a new exam. And again, we will work Jennifer will work with you to schedule a time where you could come in and retake the exam as needed. So again, knowing the scoring, right? If someone gets a 1 or a 2, the instructor, the full-time faculty member who is reviewing the exam will ask for a second reader. And so this is really meant to verify, am I reading this correctly? Is it a concern? Is there something that we need to be thinking about? If another person disagrees with the original scorer's score, then it's sent to a third faculty member for final review, and then we sort of tally up where people would put that answer, and then make a decision of whether it does not pass or it does pass. And so that's usually how that goes in terms of multiple readers. Again, that's really meant to benefit the student in terms of making sure that the answers are not necessarily just seen by one person, right? We also look at your responses and have no idea whose exam we are scoring, partly because when you come into the room, you're provided a flash drive that has a number on it, and that number corresponds to an assigned number that Jennifer has created, and only Jennifer has access to, of knowing which student goes with which number. And then that number shows up on your exam, and because all of your responses are typewritten and then printed out, and also saved on the flash drive, just as another verification of saving everything. The faculty members review all of the responses independently. They have no idea who their scores are whose exam is being scored. So just letting you know that there's a sense of privacy that's embedded into the system, just to give folks sort of an equal playing field. In the handout packet, I did provide you a handout with the score sheet. And so I just wanted to take a minute to sort of walk through that with folks. So if you have that readily available, I also have a copy that's up on the PowerPoint here, but I know that it's sometimes hard to see in terms of the font size. So the score sheet, as you can see, will have the student up at the top and the exam date. But again, the student is just the number. So it's just the number of the exam that we have in terms of your file folder that we're given. And then you are graded on overall organization of thought, overall grammar, sentence structure, punctuation, format, overall adequacy of content, and overall knowledge of theory. So you do want to do your best writing possible, right? But again, we also know that in a timed exam, you're not going to necessarily write everything APA. There's no expectation of that. We know that sometimes there's going to be a typo or people are trying to do as quickly as possible. So, do your best. That's all I'm saying. Make sure that the content is understandable, that folks know what you're generally trying to say, and ultimately folks will do as well as they can, right? That's all we're asking for. In terms of the specific questions, though, you can see sort of how there's the score of 1 to 4 for each of these questions. And again, for the choice questions, we'll only circle the ones that you have chosen. And then the force questions, everybody will have those. And then at the bottom, this is where we will sort of, as faculty, write any comments in terms of if we need a second reader for a specific content question, we would outline that, and then we will sort of say pass or needs to retake, and that is then saved and given to Jennifer for processing, right? So just so that you're aware of that. The scores themselves, we don't share with students, and partly it's just that if you pass, you pass. It doesn't really matter what your score is. If you receive all 4s, then you do get a special sort of accommodation, a special sort of recognition, and so you pass with distinction, and that will be designated in your letter. So every single student receives a letter outlining how they did. That will come via email to your email with the results. Additionally, if you need to retake any part of the exam, whether it's 1 or 2 questions or the whole whole exam. Usually there's an indication in the letter about, certainly there's an indication about that, but then we also try to have a follow-up conversation. And typically either I will have those meetings or you might be asked to meet with your faculty advisor to sit down and go through the exam question and your response to have a conversation to know what sort of didn't go well and what would need to be written differently in a future iteration of the exam when you retake either the questions or the full exam. I do want to sort of say, for most folks go through the exam and pass and maybe have to take one or two questions to rewrite. There have been a couple of occasions where students have had to retake the entire exam, but in the 5 years that I've been here, it's less than one hand, right, that I can count of folks having to retake the whole exam over by themselves. So usually folks either pass or they may have to take one or two questions and rewrite them. But usually that's the situation that we're in. Again, it's very rare that folks have to retake the entire exam over again. So I just want to sort of outline that and let folks know about that. Additionally, though, we don't discuss that, how students do on the exam. So really, you all don't need to discuss that either, right? So the only reason why folks would know how people are doing on the exam is if you disclosed. So I would just encourage folks to just sort of say, we're all in this to support one another and we don't need to ask. Curiosity in this case is not necessarily going to be helpful, so it doesn't really matter, right? So you don't have to share how you did, and the whole thing is just to get to the end. You don't have to pay again if you have to take one or two questions. If you do have to take the whole test again, in the semester, we don't charge. If you have to wait to the next one, then typically you do. So that is something that you want to keep in mind. So I do strongly encourage you that if you have to take the test in its entirety again, that you work with me to try to get a new test offered within that spring semester, so that way you can finish in the spring and retake it, so that way you aren't charged. There is a benefit to that, right? Any questions folks have about the scoring itself? Okay. So characteristics of passing scores, right, is that the answers are really complete, that you have outlined all of the different parts that is asked in the question, that you are using theory and research as applicable in the answers that you're writing, and that principles identified are and correctly applied, right? So, for example, there may be a question in terms of a counseling theory question and sort of responding to a scenario or working with a student. And one of the questions that we often will put on there is choose a theory or choose a theoretical approach to counseling, talk about why this would be appropriate, define some of the key concepts of it, and talk about the techniques that you would use as appropriate from that, right? And so oftentimes folks will use Rogers as an answer to that, right? And so person-centered theories. Well, that's great. But one of the problems that often arises is in the techniques part of the answer. And so since there are not techniques associated with Rogers and person-centered therapy, it doesn't have to be techniques, but instead you would need to outline the 3 conditions that need to be a part of that particular therapeutic approach, which would be unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, and congruence. If you don't if you don't talk about those 3 things, then you would have issues there, right? So that would be important to sort of recognize. So I just want to sort of put that out there in terms of that piece, right? So if there are specific principles or concepts that are being asked for in the question, then we would need you to show the knowledge expertise and say, well, in this particular case, there are no techniques from person-centered theory, but these 3 things are core concepts, and I would need to demonstrate that, and here's how I would do that, right? Additionally, the responses need to be well organized. So, you do need to have some organizational sort of like mechanism to make sure that you are crafting a response that's well written. So what I want you to sort of take a look at is in that packet of handouts, the presentation materials, the next piece is this chart that says reasons for failing the examinations and what to do about it. So we're going to use that to go through. And before I do get into this, I've got a question about, are the questions about the ASCA national model going to be based upon the third or the fourth model? So those of you who are PPSers, I know there's been a shift based upon that. I will need to talk with my colleagues in the PPS program about that specifically. I'm going to write a note right now, and we will get back to the PPSers to know about which model to do. I will send an email by this week. So just hold tight on that, but we will have an answer for you very soon, okay? So getting back to this chart. So as you could sort of see, we're going to ask you to sort of think about these pieces. So reason for failing the exam or the exam question. The first is didn't read or answer the question presented, right? And so what the research says to do before the exam. So typically what we're encouraging folks to do is to anticipate types of questions to be asked. So when you think about, and we're going to go into this in just a minute, when you think about the courses that you've taken, and let's say cultural proficiency, right? So if we think about cultural proficiency, that's a core piece of our program. You took the first class in 581 in your first semester, but then there are still cultural proficiency pieces that are incorporated in the rest of the program throughout, right? So anticipating types of questions to be asked, well, it would probably make sense that we would anticipate for that question or for that topic that we would need to understand what are the different stages of the continuum and how does that show up in your professional practice, right? So if we think about your practicum site or your fieldwork site, how would we sort of think about which stage is your site in the continuum, right? And so identifying that and defining each of the different stages of the continuum. Thinking about what are the guiding principles? What are the essential elements, right? And so anticipating for each of the topics what potential questions might be and how they sort of get put into practice would be an important element for preparing and studying for the exam. During the exam, in terms of this question, we would want you to underline key phrases, to diagram the sentences, and look for the verbs in the item, right? So literally, friends, you can mark up the exam questions as much as you want, and I encourage you to do so. So it would be helpful for you to go through each and every question and underline what are the main parts, and then after you have gone through and written your answer, go back in and then check off or mark off that you have actually answered that part of the question. That's great. Like, I encourage you to be able to do that if that would be helpful for you. And for some folks who are more visual, then that can be a really helpful piece of like making sure that you have marked off, checked off, however you need to do it, cross through each part of the question that you have answered. So again, you can fill this last column in on your own, but what are the strategies that work for you in terms of each of these different areas? So again, as you prepare, as you work to move forward, I would encourage you to spend some time sort of thinking about each of these. But I want to just move to the next, and we're going to go through all of these here on the chart. So the lack of theory and evidence, the research piece, what to do before the exam or to study is anticipate the major theories or ideas to be discussed, organize theories for easier recall, think about where to insert theorists and where that might be appropriate, and then during the exam, examine the item for required theories to be used. So some questions may say you need to specifically talk about this theorist, right? So again, if you think back to college student development or lifespan human development, right? So those of you in lifespan human development, one of the major assignments is having to talk about Piaget and Erikson, right? I'm pretty sure that's one of the assignments still. So those would be two theorists that you'd want to know. For those of you in college student development, thinking about a range of theorists and theories, right? And so knowing that we covered cognitive structural theories, psychosocial theories, and then also social identity theories, you probably want to have at least one in each of those categories that you feel comfortable with, that you could apply in a very general sense to any sort of question, right? In counseling theory, you may get a question talk about Rogerian or talk about Adlerian. So you may also then have to be sort of like knowledgeable about a specific theory, but typically those theories are ones that have been covered and been a main focus of a class, right? So thinking about those. Additionally, I would say for each of the different classes that you have that have some type of heavy theory, I would encourage you to have at least 2, if not 3 theories that you can sort of apply and know inside out, right? And that will be really important. And that's also connected to the next one, and I want to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So the inability to apply principles to situations. So anticipating possible ways to apply theories or ideas when studying, right? So when you think about questions that could be on the exam, how are you trying to make sure that you have examples for them? So pulling direct examples from your own professional experiences and how theory is playing out is one piece that can help you sort of study up, right? Organizing applications discussed in courses for easier recall. So we give a lot of scenarios and cases, use those to sort of make applications, either in the readings that you read or in classes. So if you have old PowerPoints from each of your classes on Blackboard, go back and review all of those, because those can give you some scenario questions that may be very similar to what might be on the comps, right? Again, this is sort of the same people who are teaching the classes are the ones who give us the questions. So those scenario-based questions may be very similar to what might be on the comps. The one piece that I think folks might get a little bit tripped up by is sometimes you will choose like 2 theories or 3 theories to study up on and really know well, and then you'll get a question that maybe both of the theories that you know really well don't really apply. And so you do need to make sure that you have at least a general enough of a sense of other theories to be able to sort of answer, and you can't sort of wedge of the theory that you know onto a scenario if it doesn't quite fit, right? That's just not good practice. And in fact, it creates a real issue, because then you might be using theory incorrectly. So you don't want to do that. So again, you do need to, you can't just sort of like study 2 theories and be done and move on. You do need to have some semblance of understanding about, in general, a multiple of theories and be able to choose. But again, you can focus on a couple. You just can't necessarily like focus on a couple and then ignore all of the others. So just keeping that in mind. So during the exam, in terms of that third row down, examine the items for required principles to be used. So if we are asking for a specific one, make sure that you're talking about that one. Examine the item for the location of where and how the principles are to be used. And so again, just making sure that in the question, what are we specifically asking you to do with the theory, right, or a concept, and making sure that you are answering that correctly and that you're using it in a relevant, appropriate way. In terms of the next down, did not organize the response before writing, right? That's often one that sort of pops up. So as you sort of prepare, create practice questions and practice outlining your responses, making sure that there's good organizational flow in your practice. Additionally, if you're using a study group, having somebody else grade or score and give you feedback on that becomes a critical piece too. So that can be a very helpful a helpful way of helping one another prepare for the exam too. And during the exam, look for cues in the items such as substeps or subparts that indicate some type of organization that we're looking for. So again, you wouldn't want to sort of give an example of how this is used in practice and without summarizing or defining first, right? So sometimes you have those types of questions where you're asked to sort of define or give specific specific information about sort of what these concepts mean, and then give 2 examples of how this is used in practice as a counselor. Well, again, you'd want to sort of define first and then go to the example, because that just helps make more sense for the reader, right? The next one, didn't manage time well and finish the exams or question. In terms of the research of what to do as preparing, so create practice questions and answer these under time constraints. If you know that you have 2 hours to write 3 responses, choose 3 questions, set a timer, write for 2 hours, and see how that goes, and see how, and practice that, because again, that's going to be a helpful skill, and you can swap questions with one another, right? So do that collaboratively, and that can be helpful in terms of, again, sharing and creating community to support one another. As you're going through the exam itself, making sure that you're reading through all of the questions. Choose the questions to answer where possible and prioritize your time, right? So one of the things that I always suggest folks do is when you first get the exam, spend time reading each of the questions. Make some decisions from a gut status of what you think are going to be the choice questions that you feel most comfortable answering, and set the other one aside. From there, work on the question that you feel like it's in your brain, you feel like you're going to have good momentum, and write the question that you feel most comfortable first. That might not necessarily be question number 1 or question number 4 in the afternoon, right? So you don't have to answer the questions as they appear on the page. We just need you to write down what number they are, so that way we know. And again, if you can sort of reorganize them before you're done, and printing them out or saving them on the flash drive so that they show up in chronological order, 1 through 3 and then 4 through 6, that's helpful. But as long as you have the number, that's fine. Like, we can jump around, it's okay. So again, like, spend your first time on the things that are going to get you momentum, that you feel most comfortable with, because that's going to help you feel a little bit more confident and hit your stride. And for those of you who are worried about sort of the blanking out, then hopefully that might be able to just be a way to sort of like not worry about that as much. Now, at the same time, there's oftentimes a sense of adrenaline, right, that rushes. So if you're a person who feels like, I'm most nervous about this question, then spend a little bit extra time with that blank scratch sheet and write down any of the notes that would be helpful to do, right? So that is also a way that you can sort of do that. One of you just got the question of, will we be turning in the notes and outlines we make during the exam? So everything is collected, but typically we don't see any of the scratch paper. The scratch paper is taken out before it gets to faculty, and it's shredded. So you do have to turn it in. We don't allow anybody to walk out with anything that they get in the room, but it's not something that the faculty see. So now if you write something on the questions themselves, then we do see that, but again, we don't look at it. We're just like looking for the question, and we look at the response. And so any of your notes, if they happen to be written on the question themselves, we just look at that. We sort of ignore that just because that's not part of what we're grading. We're grading the answer itself. So just know that. And then again, taking the exam before finishing coursework or old coursework. So in some cases, folks take the comps early, right? Like, most of you are taking them in your final semester of the program, which is what we encourage you to do. So, again, for some folks, if they are taking it where they took the coursework a couple years ago and now they're coming back, or if you're trying to take it early, that can be an issue when you're trying to when you get the two different choice questions, that might mean that like one topic you haven't actually gotten yet or haven't been able to sort of get into. And so you don't have the ability to really fully answer that question, right? So at this point, like if you're taking a class that's offered in your final semester and that's the only time that you're getting that, you're never going to be asked that question on a choice or a forced question. So I just want to make sure that folks also recognize that, like we would never ask you to answer a question that you yourself have not had as a part of your program of study up to that point. So just letting you know about that. So yeah, so I'm gonna move on. Sorry. So again, we've talked about all of these in terms of why students struggle. Most of these have already been outlined, but again, the last one that I think is important to sort of name is not using effective study strategies. So we're going to talk about study strategies at the end of our time together. But, really, we have moved this comps prep workshop up a whole month based upon students asking for additional time. So we've done that. Typically, this comps workshop is offered the first Saturday of December. But, we want to give folks more time if they think that that's going to be helpful. So as you work towards January, it will be important for you to spend at least a few minutes each week, either independently or with a study group, looking through and going through a study process. So refamiliarizing yourself with some of those key theories and concepts that are covered in some of the coursework. And again, we're going to get to specific classes that you might want to sort of think long and hard about in just a second. But again, thinking through all of those, preparing yourself, spending time. If you're just cramming at the week before because that's the time that you have, then again, most likely you may struggle more because you haven't necessarily spent the full amount of time that you need in terms of getting ready and helping yourself be prepared. So again, just thinking through for yourself, what is it that you need, and knowing yourself, what is the best strategy for yourself of moving forward and getting prepared and relearning some of this material. So what do you need to study? So these are courses that are common to both the PPS and the CSP programs, right? If it has the double asterisk next to it, this means that it could be a forced question subject area. So again, going back, it's that question that every single person could be asked, right? So the material from counseling theory and practice, the material from group counseling, ed and career planning, and cultural proficiency, right? These are four main areas of our program that I would look at as core to what we do, right? That make us unique in some ways, and that we really make sure that students understand. So I would strongly encourage you to make sure that you know those classes backwards and forwards. And again, recognizing that they could also be choice questions too, right? It doesn't mean that they just would be a forced question, but most likely these questions, and when I say most likely, I would maybe make a real note of that. Like, these are going to be on the exam, friends. And there's no way around that. So you will definitely have questions on the exam that will come from each of these four classes. So make sure that you know several of the theories that are covered in all of that. Make sure that you know for cultural proficiency, what is the continuum? What are the guiding principles? What are the essential elements, right? All of the different parts of it. Don't just rely on the continuum for cultural proficiency. You need to know all of the different component parts of the cultural proficiency model. Those were all a part of your learning. So again, tip from me to you is make sure that you're brushed up on all four of these classes in particular, but also recognize that these other classes may be on it, right? So there may be a piece that you would learn from micro skills, but typically micro skills is hard to sort of outline on a written paper because it's more of the doing, right? And it's more about sort of the application of what you learned in the 521 class. So studying up on the 521 theories is going to be more important than sort of like being able to articulate how to actually engage in active listening, right? So just recognize that piece. There may be a research question, but again, a research question is not ever going to be asked as a forced question. It may be one of the options, right? We may also ask questions that apply what you've learned in practicum or field studies, but it's going to be more of the applying the theory into practice. So there may be pieces that are sort of wrapped up, combined to like from two different classes that are in one question. If you're in the CSP program, organ admin of CSP, programs and functions, and college student development could be a forced question subject area, although I will say less likely than the four previous. So I'll just name that. But additionally, there will be potential questions around what you've learned in your leadership class, law and ethics. 511 is listed here, but actually I would take that out. So there will most likely not be an assessment and evaluation question because it's offered in the last semester. And I will update the slides after that to make sure that that's not included in future. But 584, retention and success, could be a potential question. So making sure that you have some familiarity with that. For PPS, lifespan and human development, consultation and collaboration, organ admin of PPS, and school law could be forced question areas. But again, same would apply. Typically, it's those four sort of like core classes that go across both programs. But it could be that you have a forced question on some of these. But likely, you're going to see those questions more likely as a choice question or connected to some of the other areas. So it could be, you might have to apply lifespan human development along with a counseling theory to do something, right? So that could be a type of question. But also resiliency and systems could be additional classes, and as well as ed measurement in terms of some other pieces that might show up on the exam in different ways. All right, so I do want to get into the sample examination questions. And so again, if you flip after the reasons for failing the examinations and what to do about it chart in the handouts, you'll see some questions that look like this. The first one is error 1, example 1, and this is an example of did not read or answer the question presented. So the question is, describe the discrete stages through which members of a counseling group move. In your discussion, include the behaviors of group members and the role and behaviors of the group leader at each stage. So if you flip to the next page, you'll see a response there, which I'm going to go through and read. And I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but essentially for the first, what are the discrete stages of a group? Through the group counseling process, a group moves through 5 different stages with the group leader and group members playing very different roles at each stage. The following will outline the stages of a group, some of the roles of the group leader plays in each stage, and some of the roles the group members play at each stage. The first stage of the group is the screening stage. In this stage, the group leader must decide the purpose of the group or the type of the group. She must screen interested people. She must secure a meeting place and establish a meeting time. This is also the time for the group member to select curriculum or activities for the group. The group member's role at this stage is to agree to join the group. The second stage is the initial stage. It is during the stage that the group leader sets the tone for the group. The group leader is really running the group at this stage. He or she works with the group members to establish a safe environment, establish trust among the group members, develop group norms, discuss ethical issues such as confidentiality and mandatory reporting if it's a youth group, and begins to discuss the general group goal. The third stage of the group is the transition stage. In this stage, the group leader is still running the show. He or she will challenge group members, ask clarifying questions, facilitate activities. The group leader may share some of her issues during this stage in an attempt to get members to feel comfortable and open up to one another and direct the discussion. The group members are struggling during this stage. They're still working on establishing trust. Many members have transference issues and countertransference issues, which arise at this stage, and a group may have to deal with resistance at this stage. The fourth stage of a group is a working group. It's important to note that many groups may not ever reach this stage, or the group may go back and forth between a working group and a group in transition. If the group reaches the working stage, the group's leader role becomes that of facilitator. He or she should be monitoring the group and asking clarifying questions only when another group member is not taking the leadership role. A working group becomes a cohesive unit. The members have worked through a lot of issues and are addressing the stated group goals. The ground is set for the group members to grow and develop. The fifth stage of a group is the closing or ending of the group. The group leader's role is to ensure that there is no unfinished business between group members and that every member is comfortable with the group. The group leader provides the group members with closure activities and accesses the progress of the group. This is also the time for the group leader to do some self-reflection and self-assessment as to his or her role as the group leader. Reflection by the group leader should be done at every stage of the group process. So this answer is, of course, as we sort of note, there's some problems here, right? So again, the problem with the answer here is that students did not supply a complete answer. The characteristics of the group members and the roles and behaviors for the group leader are either missing in some cases or incomplete. So there may be not enough detail, there may not be sufficient sort of evidence, so we would need a little bit more. Additionally, the stages are incorrect, right? So stage one is not screening, so screening is not a stage. Additionally, closing or ending is not a stage. So we would need to sort of make sure that folks really have a clear understanding of initial, transition, working, discuss all of those pieces, discuss all of the details of sort of what would be expected. Additionally, it's pretty well organized as a response, but there are some grammatical issues, there are some typos. So again, I'm not asking for things to be perfect, but this would probably be, in my mind, either a case of a 1 or a 2, where there is maybe being met, but it may be met with concern. So it's not necessarily the worst answer that I've ever seen, but there are some issues here that would be concerning to me that I would want to make sure would be dealt with. And certainly I might ask for a second reader if I was a faculty member receiving this response. So that's sort of example number 1 to sort of think through. I want to go to the next in the packet, which is an example of lack of theory or evidence. So the question here is a PPS question, potentially, and suppose you were asked by a school district to give a presentation entitled Adolescent Behavior and Development, Implications for Education. You're being asked to describe at least 3 major theoretical perspectives from lifespan human development and/or counseling theories you would include in your talk, and the ways in which these could be applied in the classroom. Be sure to define key concepts in your response. So for this one, the response here is, for the above presentation, the theories I would discuss are the following. I would begin with Piaget's learning theory. I would give a brief overview of the 4 stages, but focus on those stages that are most important at this stage of the student's life, namely concert operational and formal operational. I would provide the teachers with information on how to design curriculum that encompasses the need of the students in the concrete stage. For example, a lot of hands-on examples. Plus, suggest the teachers use more abstract concepts to address the needs of those students who are thinking at the formal, more abstract level. Next, I would discuss the basic issue relating to Erikson's psychosocial development theory, explaining to the teachers Erikson's idea of developmental crisis. I would use this theory to provide the teachers insight into student behavior, and perhaps after hearing about the early crisis of, for example, trust versus mistrust, and the later crisis of intimacy versus isolation, the teacher would have more empathy for some of my dynamic students. I think it's important when one is discussing student behavior to also mention Kohlberg's moral development theory. It too can give teachers insight into ways some students will try to so hard to please them, level 1, and some students are only interested in the school rule, level 2. Clearly, when discussing adolescent students with teacher classroom management issues arise, I would spend most of my presentation time discussing Glasser's reality theory and the classroom management techniques he developed from his therapy model. If a teacher can learn to respond to the behavior and not to the child and separate his or herself from the student's control issue, he or she is going to be in a better position to actually teach the class. So in this specific example, there are several things that are concerning from a faculty perspective, right? So there's really no clear discussion of the stages for Piaget or Erikson. Now, a couple have been named, but they're actually not really sort of defined, right? And so we would want you to describe at least those perspectives, right? So the question is asking you for description and to define key concepts in your response. So just talking about formal operation, for example, or concrete operation, there's no real understanding of what that means by the reader. Additionally, in the Erikson piece, there's the discussion of trust versus mistrust, or intimacy versus isolation, but there's no real definition of what happens in each of those stages or those developmental crises. So we would want you to sort of expand on that and give more definition. Additionally, the correct ages for that, or the correct stages for this age group aren't defined or not described. The Glasser theory is really misstated, so there's not a lot of discussion there, and Glasser is not necessarily used appropriately. And the student didn't really show a clear or thorough understanding of these theories and their application to the classroom or the school. So we would want you, if you had a question like this, to sort of give a little bit more discussion of, like, if you were to give a presentation, how would you fold these into an actual presentation? You aren't just going to necessarily go and sort of describe these theories just for the sake of the theories. So how would you actually put them into practice? How would you actually fold them in through learning activities, and who's the audience, right? So trying to craft some of that would be important. I'm going to skip the next one in the packet, but I do want to show you the exemplary answer. So the next one after that is, the question is, compare and contrast the way in which two different counseling theories would approach helping a college student who has become depressed over academic difficulties. Include in your discussion elements such as the counselor's role, possible origins of the problems, strategies, etc. And so this answer is as follows. A college counselor whose orientation is Carl Rogers' theory would treat a student depressed over academic difficulties differently from a counselor who uses Alfred Adler's for her theoretical basis. The underpinning of Rogers' person-centered theory is that humanity is essentially good, and given the right circumstances, people can self-actualize. That is, they can realize for themselves how to become a fully functioning human being within the context of their values and abilities. For this reason, a Rogerian therapist would listen to the college student's issues. She would offer unconditional positive regard, active listening, and she would reflect back to the student what he has shared. She would not, however, ask any probative questions. Her responses would be limited to reflecting and clarifying what the student offers. Except to be there for the student, the Rogerian therapist would not use any specific techniques to assist the student on working through his difficulties. The approach is phenomenological, present-oriented, and inherently non-judgmental. While Adlerian therapy is also phenomenological, the student who approached an Adlerian therapist would have a very different experience. While both Rogers and Adler believe that human beings are innately good, an Adlerian therapist sees the individual within a social context, and Adlerian therapy is goal-oriented. While both counselors would begin the process of counseling with an informed consent to enable the student to collaborate in the process of self-discovery, the Adlerian might then begin to ask the student about his family constellation. The student would be encouraged by the therapist to share the social context in which he grew up and that in which he finds himself now engaged. The Adlerian counselor not only reflects back to the student what he has said, but she may endeavor to interpret the information, pointing out to the student when there is paradoxical intent, or what his actions and goals are not necessarily in alignment. While the counselor runs the risk of being wrong about the interpretation, her regard for the client and the premise that the meetings are collaborative should enable the student to disagree if she is wrong. Sometimes these exchanges, even when the initial interpretation was wrong, result in insight on the part of the student. Because a Rogerian therapist is present-oriented, she would not explore the origins of the problem except as presented by the student. In the absence of specific techniques, she would not ask probing questions to ascertain if this is a pattern or an aberration. On the other hand, an Adlerian will look into the past and the future, as well as at the present circumstances. The counselor may inquire of the student if this is a pattern for which he has repeated, and how this current academic difficulty impacts goal setting for the future. In that, depression can be defined as either temporary, the kind of down in the dumps because I failed a test feeling, or clinical, that is, it persists for weeks with or without a triggering event. both counselors would be actively listening for signs of clinical depression. If such signs emerged in the college setting, the counselor would refer the student to a more highly qualified individual. Temporary depression can, however, be effectively treated with either therapeutic approach. Given a very positive interpersonal relationship, a counselor using Carl Rogers' active listening and unconditional positive regard may find that the appropriately vocal student can work through his depression and actualize himself. With the range of techniques available to someone who uses Adler as a springboard, the student may find himself leaving the counselor's office with homework, a contract, or journal assignment. By using these specific techniques, the student may learn to reorient himself to either the way he studies, what he is studying, or life in general. An insight that might be provoked by a family constellation chart might be that the student realizes he is pursuing his father's dream, not the dream he has for himself. While both counseling approaches believe that the individuals possess within themselves the key to solving their problems, they differ most notably in the absence of specific techniques for Rogerian therapy, while Adler has borrowed from many other areas. Which theory the counselor would choose at the outset might depend on the culture of the student, his ability to verbalize, and the extent of his depression. A Rogerian approach might, for example, be useful if the student is at a crisis, falling deeper into depression, while able to be verbal about what he's experiencing. In this instance, all the student may need is an environment in which he does not feel judged. As he verbalizes and the counselor reflects back to him, the insights may arise naturally. With a student who's not very verbal, a counselor might be better able to get at both the origins and assist the client in reaching a possible solution. An Adlerian approach would probably be more productive. So, this is a very long, detailed answer. It's an answer that probably would be scored as a 4, right, on the scale of 1 to 4. The compare and contrast goes back and forth between Rogerian and Adler, being very specific in terms of key concepts, techniques, specific pieces that are defined by both, but also talking about the similarities and the ways in which they diverge in terms of similarities, right? So ways that they are uniquely themselves as theoretical approaches, but also always situating what's being asked in terms of helping the student, right? So how would these different approaches and techniques be used to help a student who is depressed over academic difficulties, right? So again, that gets looped back through time and time again and shown and discussed. So that's a really great sort of response that we would love to see in terms of this. Now, there's still some typos, there's still some pieces that aren't perfect, but it's still a 4. Right? The content is really there. So again, just as an example for this, there is one additional exemplary answer as well that's in here. But again, I'm going to provide that to you. You can sort of read that on your own and use that as a part of your study process. But again, just trying to do some of those. So at this point, I'm going to take a break from talking and ask, are there any questions about these questions that we've just covered or anything that I've covered up to this point? And again, if folks want to, I'm going to actually stop the share for just a moment. If folks want to unmute themselves, they can. And again, you can do that down in the left-hand corner of the Zoom screen. You could just hit the microphone button. You can ask your question, or you can type in a question if you would rather not talk into the chat box. So I'm going to take a sip of my tea and see if folks have questions.
Dr. Tillapaw?
Yes.
Hi, this is Carl. I just want to say not that I'm a judge or anything, but great job. It's very informative so far.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. You're covering pretty much everything, every question I could think of.
Good.
That's it.
Excellent. Thank you. So I did just get a question in, a couple of questions in the chat. So if we choose to refer to a specific theory or theorist or principle, what's the requirement for citations and references? So we do not expect that you actually are citating or giving a citation or providing references at all. So there's no need for that at all. So that's sort of that piece. So basically, we're not asking for APA. And as you can see, sort of even within that last answer, that was rated as a 4. No citation, no nothing. It's just that we want you to know the information and can outline it. We don't need you to put a source or any of that. So just so that you're aware. Yep. The other question is, can I sign up for this workshop again? So the comps prep workshop is only offered once. So this is the session that's for folks who are taking the January exam. If you're not taking the January exam, you could certainly sign up again in April. The April comps prep workshop is offered for folks who are taking the June and September exam. So, but again, this is being recorded. It'll be sent back to you. And again, if there are specific questions, you can always make an appointment with either myself or your faculty advisor to sit down and go through over anything that doesn't make sense or you need clarification about. So, you can always make an appointment to do that if there are additional pieces that need going over, okay? So I'm going to continue, not seeing any other questions. Actually, there was one that just came in, sorry. So the question, yes, so the exam is offered only at the Thousand Oaks campus. And we will let you know where to come. Typically, it is either we're using the computer labs in the Spies-Bornemann Center for Education and Technology, where all of our faculty offices are. Or sometimes we also, due to size, use a computer lab over in Swenson. So it'll either be Swenson or SBET, depending upon the size. So there are over 40 of you who RSVP'd for the comps prep workshop. So I imagine that we're going to have a very big group taking comps potentially. And I know some folks are still making the decision of comps versus thesis. Yeah, we'll probably use a multitude of rooms just to space out and give folks a little bit of breathing room so that we're not crunched and on top of one another. But the exam will be at the TO campus. So thanks for asking that question. Okay, so studying for the exam and preparing for the exam. So again, we've talked about some of this because of the worksheet that we first used. But before the exam, it is important to anticipate the types of questions to be asked, right? So most folks, let's just use the example of group counseling, for example, right? So group counseling questions typically are like if you had to sort of think about group counseling and what you learned from group counseling in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, what might you expect a type of question to be asked? I'm just going to put it back on you for a minute, but what types of questions would you imagine might be asked about group counseling? Okay, knowing about the stages of group counseling, absolutely, right? Which actually connects back to the question that we just went through about groups, right? So the error number 1 example of describing the discrete stages, absolutely. So Yvonne just said the roles people play in group, right? So what you might get as a question would be just around those things. So it may be specific. So let's say that you are a group leader working with a group of students that are pressing back against your facilitation. They are not trusting one another. They are, you have some folks who are reluctant to speak. What stage are they in? And what would you do as the group leader to move them to the next stage, right? That might be a type of question that might be asked, where you actually have to identify, out of the different stages of group development, which stage are they in? How would I then, as the group leader, need to work through those issues and then help them move and facilitate to the next, right? Again, another question that came in, how to deal with the dynamics of a member who may need to leave or are causing issues within group, and how would you as a facilitator or group leader be addressing that, right? That could be a definite question as well, right? So again, what I want you to think about is, for each of these different classes that you've had, what might be possible different questions that could be asked? And what would be helpful is open up a Word document and just start sort of putting in several different ones. And if multiple of you do that and you craft your own sort of questions that you assume might be asked, you could then share that and compile that as a cohort, put it into a Google Doc. Help one another within your community, and support one another, because then you can pull from that as a test bank or as a practice test bank, and then set the timer, and for 2 hours, see if you can respond to those, right? And so that is a really, really helpful way of preparing. So create your own, have other people create your own, then share with one another, right? Anticipate the major theories or ideas. Go back to your notes. Go back to the PowerPoints, right? The reason why I, as an instructor, always keep the PowerPoints up is for students to have access to that. But not every instructor keeps their PowerPoints up on Blackboard, right? So you also then need to go back to the books, your notes, share those pieces, brush up on those major theories or ideas or concepts that are covered in the classes that you think might be important, and do that. Organize your theories for easier recall. So rewriting your notes and maybe doing flashcards, maybe doing different mnemonic devices, right? So like if there are different parts that you think of a theory, trying to come up with an acronym to remember the different component parts might be helpful, right? So using and organizing those theories for easier recall will be an important way of sort of studying. Again, thinking about where to insert theory or theorists that is appropriate. We're not asking you to, if the question doesn't ask for it, don't feel like you're going to earn points by throwing in some knowledge that doesn't really align with the question, though, right? So again, be smart about how you're incorporating theories and concepts in, if it's appropriate, if it makes sense, and if you're adequately discussing them in a way that makes sense. Terrific. But don't just force theory in if it doesn't make sense to force theory in, right? Don't get yourself into trouble there. And again, think about how you're applying these theories and concepts into your practice. So, for example, many of you are currently in fieldwork classes, right? So when you're doing your work, think about how career development theory and supers theory may be playing a role in the ways in which you're engaging with particular students, right? So trying to sort of think about that. So going back, one of the questions is, what do you mean organized theory for easier recall? So again, if you, as you study, instead of just sort of referring back to the PowerPoints, again, think about if you had to if you're choosing Chickering's vectors, right? Well, then you might actually write out all of Chickering's vectors 1 through 7, but then create sort of a sentence or a mnemonic device based upon the first word of each of those vectors. That would be a way for you to remember it in your head of each of those vectors in order, right? So that's what I mean by organizing theory for easier recall. Trying to come up with sort of devices for you that are good tricks to remember all of those different categories, those different concepts in a way that makes sense. And then organize applications. Yes, so Strive as an example. Yes, so that's exactly a mnemonic device. So the Strive model that we have for the GSOE, there's, we know Strive, but each of the different letters there means something, right? So, that's an example. Organize applications discussed in courses for easier recall. So again, when you think about the fieldwork that you're doing, when you think about assignments, when you think about different things that you've had to do where you've had to go out and observe folks doing the work and how the concepts are playing out. When you think about your cultural proficiency interviews that you've done with people, those might be things that you can pull to sort of make conceptual connections between the theories that we're covering and how things get done professionally in practice, right? So all of that may be an opportunity for you to sort of study and use all of that in your preparation. Moving to the next screen, if I can get it to work, practice questions. Create those questions that you came up with, and then go ahead and start to outline what they are, and then move to actually answering them under time constraints, right? So if you have an outline, you can sort of create sort of like bulleted points or notes, and then you can then practice answering them within the time constraint. So even if it's just one question, set your timer for half an hour and see what you can write in half an hour around one of your sample questions that you've come up with. If you don't feel well prepared, then I do encourage you to consider putting the exam off potentially. But again, I want to stress, right? Like recently there was a situation where a student came in and having to take the exam, and they were super nervous. And they kept saying, "I'm not ready. I don't know this. I don't know it." And the student passed, right? So like also recognize for yourself of whether you're just anxious or that you're not prepared, right? And so that's part of what you really need to sort of think through. You have multiple months before this exam. You can study. You have been through all of this. You have made it through this program this far. I know that each of you knows more than you're giving yourself credit for. I promise you that you know more than you think. So part of it is, yes, courses that you took at the beginning of your program, you are going to need to brush up on, right? And that's totally fine. That makes sense. But at the same time, like you are actually doing this practice in the field. So think about everything that you're doing and you're at your sites right now, your practicum, your fieldwork sites. Think about ones that you've done, previous to this. You have been using theories and different concepts in different ways. So when you're thinking about a particular situation where you have been counseling a student, think about that memory and then try to see, like, was there anything that I could sort of think about from a human development standpoint that I would have been using in that moment? Is there anything from a counseling theory piece that I would sort of think about, right? So all of this is going to be really, really important for you to just recognize you know more than you think. I promise you do. But part of it is about taking time, taking some deep breaths, taking some mindfulness moments, and figuring out for yourself, what is it that I know really well right now off the top of my head, and what is it that I'm going to really need to go and brush up on because I don't remember a lot of this, right? So even spending that amount of time in your preparation of going through each and every one of your courses, literally go into Blackboard, right? And open it up and say, okay, 527, how do I feel about career and ed planning? Do I feel good about it? Do I need to brush up and spend a lot of time on that class, right? Go down the list in Blackboard and go through that for yourself of just a gut feeling, right? And make a list out of that. And then you can sort of break down your time and how much preparation you need to sort of spend on each of the classes based upon some of those sort of choices that you're making right in that moment, right? So again, just sort of think through this, but again, I promise all of you know more than what you think you are. Additionally, you may want to join a study group. And again, we're going to talk about study groups in just a minute. We'll come back to that. So again, during the exam, one of the things that I'm going to encourage folks to do, even before you get to these pieces on this slide, is one, take some deep breaths, friends. Adrenaline is going to hit you. You're going to be nervous. You're going to feel stressed. I can't resolve that and let that go. But you can try to center yourself as much as possible, right? So some of you all who had me in micro skills, I talk about the deep breaths and grounding yourself. Some of you have had Dr. Coronado, you do mindful minutes, you do whatever it is that you need to take. But I encourage you to not let yourself and your brain run amok and cause more hurt and concern for you the day of the exam, right? So be positive, go in with a positive mindset, go in feeling as confident as you can, right? And hype yourself up. Think about what you're listening on the way in, choose a favorite song, do all of the prep that you need to do in terms of doing your best as you move in. You will get a scratch sheet of paper. Please, I encourage you to write down anything that comes to mind that you would need to sort of like have a note for yourself. Then when you get the questions, definitely go ahead and underline key phrases, diagram the sentences. And again, for some people who don't know what diagram sentences are, right? Like you can go online and find a better sort of like definition or explanation than what I'm going to do. But you may want to draw boxes around, you may underline, you may make some notes, right? Like doing all of that, whatever makes sense. Because again, if you're a visual person, breaking up the sentence that's just typed out may be helpful, right? And then additionally, look for response verbs in the item. So again, if there are specific things that are asked in terms of outline the steps or outline the stages, make sure that you're then highlighting what those steps and stages are. Make sure that if there's a required theory to be used, that you are outlining that theory, right? If you don't talk about it, then that's automatically going to be a 1, right? So you want to make sure if the theory is outlined that you need to be using, that you are covering that specifically. Think about, again, where to insert theories and research. Examine the item for the required principles to be used. So again, for cultural proficiency, I'll say it one more time. If I'm asking on a cultural proficiency question for you to describe the guiding principles and you use instead the essential elements, then that's going to be an issue, right? So again, making sure that you're clear about each of the different component parts of a model and that you're addressing those appropriately. Examining the item for where and how principles are to be used. So again, if there's a specific situation, so in a scenario, if I, for example, part of the question is that you're working with a student who may be undocumented, then there may be a need for you to really make sure that you're honing in on that piece of the question and that you're responding appropriately or using a theoretical approach or a career development theory or some type of what we're asking appropriately, right? So we're partly asking to make sure that you would use developmentally appropriate concepts for the students in which you might be serving, right? And so making sure that it's a good fit rather than, again, a theory that that you might know, but might not necessarily be the right theory to use, right? So keeping that in mind. Again, looking for cues in the item, such as those subparts or steps, reading through all of the questions. So again, I think some folks, the adrenaline hits and you are sort of half reading. And so you might sort of read part of the question, but not all of it. And so you might only respond to part of it. Well, if you haven't answered the full question, then again, you might not necessarily do as well. So make sure that you are answering everything. Choosing and prioritizing items for responses. So again, just thinking through like what makes most sense in terms of the theory or the concept that I know and how would we apply it here. using a watch to time response creation. So again, like you'll each have a computer, so you'll know the time. You can keep track of that. But if it's helpful to have a wristwatch that's not an Apple Watch, but if it's just a plain wristwatch that you want to use to sort of keep time, if it's helpful to have it on your computer, but like keeping track and dividing up how much time do I want to spend on each of these things, right? If you spend you have a 2-hour block, you have 3 questions. So if you could ideally spend half an hour for each question, and then you have an extra half an hour to go back and beef up, revise, add on, do any final tweaks to, that could be a helpful way of splitting up some of the time that you have. But again, you want to use your time as most effective as possible, right? So that becomes really important. And so again, you do want to embed some time where you can reread your response, go back to the question, make sure that you have adequately answered all parts of that question. And if you haven't, then spend that time quickly going through and addressing what's missing, right? And also, if you have time to fix those organizational or grammatical errors, then go ahead and do that, right? Use spell check. Use the grammar tool of the green underline, right? So like anything that can be used to help you, that's just going to help you in the end boost up points. Again, though, everybody's aiming for a 2 or higher, right? So again, we're aiming for what's going to get us a passing grade. So again, use your time however you need. Content to me is always more important than sort of the formatting, the grammatical pieces. Like I'm looking specifically to make sure that you know and have knowledge and expertise in being able to explain key concepts and applying them into practice. So study groups. For some of us, study groups can be a very, very helpful tool, particularly if time is limited, right? Or if we sometimes need accountability, right? So oftentimes it's really helpful when trying to learn information and concepts, and to be able to sort of rely on community. For some of us, we like to do things independently. And if that's the case, great. But I also think that like you can use a blend of independent study time and also an occasional use of study groups to then break out of the cycle or the rut that we can sometimes get ourselves into, where like we need actual support as we prepare for something like comps, right? So you don't have to go to study group every week if that doesn't work for you and your style. But for some folks, you're going to get more if you at least go and connect a couple of times with a study group, because you're hearing different insights and folks can give you feedback and folks can review some of your responses and answers. You can share information. So it can be a collaborative process, right? So again, benefits of study groups here outlined on the slide. It can pick you up, right? Be a pick you up when you find that your motivation is slipping to study, and it can be a source of encouragement. If you're doing it all on your own, it can feel very lonely. If you're more reluctant to ask a question to other instructors, oftentimes it's easier to do that with your peers and in a small setting, right? So again, like I think about like even in class, right? If I ask a question in a large group, sometimes it's crickets in the room. But if I have you pair up or do small groups, then suddenly there's lots of chatter, lots of discussion. Same thing happens here, right? So be able to sort of work in a small group setting with folks who you feel really connected to. You may become more committed to study because the group members are depending on you showing up and being prepared, and you don't want to let them down. So sometimes we can sort of be like, oh, I'll study. I'm so tired, I'll study later. But if we're doing that on our own, then it's easier to kick the can. If other people are depending upon us, then we have to sort of show up and we have to do it. So again, that might be helpful. Group members will listen and discuss information and concepts during study sessions, and those help in terms of auditory learners, like bring an auditory dimension to your learning experience than just sitting by yourself at home reading and not really hearing a discussion, right? And so that can be really important. And again, one or more of the group members may understand something that you don't, and they may bring up other ideas that you've never considered. So that can be helpful. You can learn new study habits. You can compare your class notes with those of other group members to clarify your notes and fill in any of the gaps that you have. You can teach and explain information and concepts to other group members to help reinforce your mastery of information and concepts, right? So one of the things that I always encourage folks to do is, as you study for comps, it can be helpful for you to actually teach other folks the theories that you're studying for yourself, because it helps to reinforce for you what you need to know. And you might actually even create like a PowerPoint or another sort of like visual to then help folks sort of do that on your own. So it helps you, it also helps others. And again, studying on your own can really be boring. So interacting with other people might make it more enjoyable as a process. So again, study groups don't just happen. So here's what you should do to get a study group started. You know your classmates at this point very well. You've talked with them throughout the program. You know who you vibe with. You know different sort of personalities, who meshes well, who doesn't. So again, when you're selecting a classmate to join and create a study group, you should be able to answer yes for each of the following questions. Is the classmate motivated to do well? Is this classmate understand the subject matter? Is this classmate dependable? Would this classmate be tolerant of ideas of others? And would you like to work with this classmate? And if that's the case, then you can create that study group, right? So keep those questions in mind as you form your groups. You should invite enough classmates to work with you until you've formed a group of 3 to 5. I would strongly encourage keeping it small, because ultimately, if there's a large group, things tend to then move to like a lot of chatter, a lot of side conversations. It's really easy to get off track. But if it's a smaller group, then folks can sort of have more accountability, and you can sort of do more of the learning that needs to be happening. You decide how long and for how often you need to meet. But I do think that even if it says here, meeting 2 or 3 times a week is probably best. But I also know as grad students, that's probably hard to impossible. So what I might suggest is like once a week, trying to do an in-person or even like a online like Skype or FaceTime meeting. And if you did a couple of hours, if you could do it in person, great, that's even better. But a couple hours would be really good, because you can sort of break down classes and make sure that you cover 2 classes in each one of those study group sessions, and that maybe not everybody's even having to do the same class, right? So you can sort of figure that out, make sure that you're including some breaks, but that you don't want to go too long. If you do something like 3 or 4 hours, sometimes that can be really too long. You're not actually retaining information. You're sort of, people can disconnect pretty easily. But if you could do, an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, then that's probably a time where folks can still be connected. Decide where you meet. Meet in a place that is free from distraction. So usually, a coffee shop might not be good because you might get distracted. But, if you want to go use the Woodland Hills Center, if you want to use Oxnard, if you want to use a classroom at TO, if you want to go to somebody's house and rotate locations based upon your study group, great, like you can do that. But you would need to want to check. So the question came up is, my campus center location, is it open on the weekends? You would want to check the website. The hours are always there. If you go onto the website and just do a quick search in CalLou's website, it'll pop up what the hours are. I don't know all of the hours, but I do know usually there are some weekend hours, I believe, at the satellite campuses, but usually not both days. So just keep that in mind, but you can take a look. Thank you for responding. So Woodland Hills is open Saturdays from 10 a.m. until 3. So decide on the goals of your study group. Goals could be comparing notes, discussing readings, preparing for the exam. Each group session should have a different leader, so rotate who the leader should be. Thank you, Christina. So Oxnard, Saturday and Sunday is open from 10 until 3. So great. So both of those centers are available. Also decide whether it's the same person who will lead the session or whether there will be a rotating. The leader of a study session should be responsible for meeting the goals of that study session. An agenda is really helpful for the first study session, and you can sort of create different agendas for each one. So at the end of each session, figure out what is it that we want to sort of do as the assignment for next, so that way you have a clear agenda and moving forward. And that everybody has their contact information, right? That becomes important. So again, characteristics of a successful study group. Each group member is contributing to discussions. Group members actively listen to one another without interrupting. Only one group member speaks at a time. Other group members work collaboratively to resolve any concerns raised by a group member. Group members are prompt and come prepared to work. The group stays on task with respect to its agenda. They show respect for one another. They feel free to criticize each other, but keep their criticisms constructive. That way, this can encourage group members to reveal their weaknesses so that they can strengthen them. Feel free to ask questions of one another. And again, at the end of each study, create that agenda for the responsibilities that need to be prepared for the next session. And again, recognizing that this is collaborative. We all need one another to succeed in order to be successful on the comps exam, right? So use the collective wisdom and be able to use that. So some possible pitfalls that I think are important to just keep in mind is don't let the study group get distracted from its agendas and goals. Don't let it become a social group. You can always socialize before or after. Go drink the wine, go do happy hour afterwards to celebrate, whatever you need to do, but don't do it during, right? Don't allow group members to attend unprepared. To stay in the group, members should always be required to do their fair share and hold each other accountable to that. Don't let the session become a negative forum for complaining about instructors or courses, and don't allow one or two group members to dominate the group. So make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to participate. That becomes really critical. So again, just a simple piece here, reiterating some of this. Divide up your preparation tasks, create outlines of course content to review with the group, create simple questions for the group. And again, I'm always a big fan of Google Docs and being able to share that and update it. So that way, as you're studying, you might add to a collective list. And then that list will just grow as folks are preparing. And then you could sort of use them when you get to the time where you might use a study group to actually do a timed exam response. Then actually share the questions and responses to one another and have folks grade them of what you think. You can, again, you have the score sheet. So you could even attempt to create a mock exam yourself and then score them using the score sheets the faculty use. Meet at least once a week as you lead into the exam. If you have more time over the break period, then sure, you could meet more than once a week if you felt that would be useful. But again, meeting at least once a week is important. And again, I would say no more than 5 to 6 people and no less than 3. I think having 3 or 4, maybe 5, can be a really good number, healthy number for folks to sort of think through. So the last piece in the packet of material handouts is steps to ensure my success on the comprehensive exam. And so I'm including this because what I think is helpful for each one of you to take some time to think about is, what is it that you need to do as daily tasks or weekly tasks between now and January 25th to sort of do? So what are the tasks that you need to accomplish? What needs to be outlined? So be specific on here. If you need to organize your materials, by when, right? If you need to create notes for some of the classes and just brush up, when are you going to do that? And even break it down by class. What's your daily or weekly study plan, both individually, but also as a group? And so once you've formed a potential study group, what are you going to take a look at? What are the things that they need to know? And then including this in your worksheet as well. So you don't have to use this worksheet, but it's an option as a tool to sort of think through for yourself any of the needs that you need to do for all of the different tasks to prepare you as best you can to get to January and feel as confident as possible, right? I know some folks have sort of asked the question, how can we form a study group with other students aside from our PPS cohort? I would encourage you to sort of if you want to reach out to folks from other cohorts, you can. I would say, though, you have a pretty well, you know one another, and you know what folks have as characteristics. So I would say you might want to stay with folks that you know, because that's going to actually create a better study group, because you have a better sense of who folks are, rather than working with folks that you might not know. But if there's a need, then certainly we can help make connections for folks and send out emails within the group. You can always post in the Facebook group for the department that we have, and say, hey, like, we have a study group that's meeting here if folks want to join us. And you could sort of share questions or do some different things that way. That's an option as well. Thank you, Christina. One of the things that Christina notes is just for folks to plan. Both the Woodland Hills Center and Oxnard Center are closed between the holiday break, so December 20th through January 2nd. They're closed. I also would say that the Woodland Hills Center often, sometimes the office or the operational hours, unlike Oxnard, sometimes will go later than that as well, just because not all classes are meeting, although there are some winter term classes that will meet. So the hours are slightly different. So just recognize that what happens in fall does sometimes switch in the spring semester. So the last piece that I want to sort of let folks think about is, each of you, again, have gotten this far in the program. So I really want each of you to think about these two questions, right? What are your strengths as a student? Think about what has served you well to get to this point, and focus on that as it relates to preparing for the exam. So if you're a good teacher, use that in your study group to help folks think through key concepts, help folks understand in different ways. If you are a person who's a strong writer, then use that to help organize your materials and potentially share that with one another, so that way you can sort of benefit from everyone's expertise. If you're a good reader, if you're a good talker, right, use all of the strengths that you have to prepare yourself as best you can, because again, you all have strengths as students. You have different strengths, but again, as you're choosing your study group, you may want to have different folks who have different strengths than you also be a part of your group, because again, the more diversity you have and the more strengths that you have that are different from one another, the more you're going to be able to fill those gaps that you might not necessarily have for yourself as a strength. And so how can you leverage those strengths in your work towards the comps exam? Again, using collective knowledge and wisdom becomes really critical. If you're one of the folks who's really anxious about things, then having somebody who's a little bit more grounded can help you feel a little bit more grounded, right? So again, choosing folks to work with on this, and you might have a couple different study groups, right, that you're using in different ways. You don't have to always have the same one. And so again, just thinking through, you all have expertise. You all have a lot of knowledge. I promise you, you do. Part of it is just figuring out how you can use those strengths to really build as much as you can to get to a good place as you move towards January and the comps. So this last piece is, we want you to succeed, and that really is true. As faculty, this exam, we build it in a way that we feel is developmentally appropriate for what folks need out in the field, in order to be well prepared and to be knowledgeable as counselors. So we're not trying to trick people. We're not trying to trip anybody up. We're really trying to ask some very base questions around the curriculum that you have taken already. So part of this is just tapping in for yourself, taking some deep breaths, believing in yourself, and trying to, again, study up, build your skills, revisit some of the class content, and to be able to sort of apply concepts into your professional practice. If you're able to do that, then you're going to be very competent and do well on the exam. And again, aim for what you need to do as your standard, right? And each of us has a different standard. But again, if you go in thinking, I'm not going to be able to do this, then typically that's what's going to end up happening. You're not going to do as well. So if you approach it from a place of, I can do this, I will do this, I'm going to be okay, and I do know this stuff, and you have studied well, then you probably will do just as well as possible on the exam, and that's all we're asking. So at this point, that's the presentation. I'm going to open it up. If folks have questions, you can, again, unmute yourself. You can type into the chat. But again, I want to revisit if there are any questions that you had posed at the very beginning of the session that I have not answered or addressed. I definitely don't want you to leave now without getting that information. So anything that I can help answer. Okay. So I'm glad. I hope this was helpful for folks. I hope that this has maybe relieved some stress or anxiety. I hope that folks are feeling a little bit more confident about moving forward. I really do encourage you to start setting up study groups as quickly as possible. Don't wait until the end of the semester if you can avoid it. Again, the sooner that you can start this work and work towards preparing yourself as much as possible, that will be important. Again, as soon as this is over, I will then work to get this uploaded onto YouTube, and we will send out a message to everybody who RSVP'd, so that way you have this for reference and you can watch it back if you need. Thank you so much for, again, your flexibility. I'm sorry that we had to move it to an online session, but I hope that this was really helpful for folks. And if you have any questions, again, I just want to reiterate, you can feel free to be in touch with myself or your faculty advisor with any specific questions as we move forward and as you study, so that way you get everything that you need to feel successful moving forward for the exam. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.